Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We are here to talk a little bit about the federal consumer privacy proposals and their impact on America's schools. My name is Sara Kloek. I'm the Vice President of Education and Children's Policy at SIIA. I handle our education and children's policy issues. I spent some time at the U.S. Department of Education and on Capitol Hill, and I spent a lot of time thinking about consumer privacy and education privacy and how they play together. I'm going to hand it over to my co-panelists to talk a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get into the meat of the issues today. Amelia?
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm Amelia Vance. I've been working on child and student privacy pretty much exclusively for the past decade. And I'm the president and founder of the Public Interest Privacy Center, a nonprofit soon to get, knock on wood, IRS approval for 501c3 status. I'm also an adjunct professor for privacy law and EU data protection at William & Mary Law School and run the Student and Child Privacy Center at AASA. So very excited to be here.
Kristin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristin Wolfel. I am a policy counsel here at CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm on the Equity and Civic Tech team here, and we handle a lot of the education work. Well, I should say all of the education work. So we've been doing a lot of work recently, a lot of collaboration on some of the kid safety bills, and then keeping an eye on consumer privacy movement generally and how it might impact schools.
Great, thank you. So we're going to spend some time talking about the upcoming proposals. There's a hearing on Wednesday that we'll get into about what they're going to talk about a little bit more, but I'm going to toss it over to Amelia to briefly talk about why do we need information in education anyways? And I know that is a silly question, maybe for some folks that are in education, but Amelia, can you tell us about why data is used in education?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, this feels like such an easy, obvious question, but I got into this area because we suddenly had hundreds and then thousands of student privacy bills introduced across the US, 146 of which have passed into law in the past decade. And many of them had to be fixed. Obviously, we have fewer than 146 states. Many of those laws had to be fixed because there wasn't necessarily a consideration of how the laws would impact day-to-day school operations. So some of the important reasons I always love to share when this question comes up, the Data Quality Campaign's resources and FAQs on the value of education data. It can help families and educators get timely, easy to understand information to support individuals in decision-making, making sure that school bus drivers know that when a student has, which student has an allergic reaction to something, or the cafeteria workers, so they don't have something with peanuts or whatever it may be. It allows for more personalization of learning. It allows for better reporting as required under federal and state laws. Education data is essential, and making sure that we think about all the different aspects of it and the ways to communicate about its value and show its value is incredibly important, particularly when we're in a legislative environment where schools may not be mentioned at all.
Yeah, and some of the proposals, Amelia, some of the, I know you've been working on this for a while, and Kristin, feel free to jump in here too, but some of the unintended consequences we saw of some of those student privacy proposals, I've seen your riff over the several years, but including some teachers in one state not wanting to work on the school yearbook for fear of going to jail. There were a lot of unintended consequences when the good intentions were to protect student privacy, but unintended consequences without thinking about the realities of how this information is used, shared, accessed in the schools is something why we've always at SIIA emphasized the importance of bringing educators and school administrators into and education technology vendors to learn about how this information is actually protected in the schools and used in the schools, because it's not an easy thing, and it's not an open and shut case. It's way more complicated. So let me go into a little bit, just level the playing field a little bit about the background of some of the consumer privacy efforts that have been happening in Congress. Congress has been trying to push forward a consumer privacy law for many, many decades. And in the past couple of years, Congress has considered the ADPPA in the House, and not so much in the Senate, but was introduced by a senator to bring broad consumer privacy protections to all Americans. At the same time, many states are considering consumer privacy laws, and there has been a major push at the federal level to enact some broad consumer privacy law to ensure that Americans have all protections. At the same time, Congress has been considering children's privacy legislation. You may be familiar with the Kids Online Safety Act or the updates to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. These are all being considered in Congress. Just last week, Maria Cantwell and Kathy McMorris Rogers introduced the American Privacy Rights Act, which is a new consumer privacy law, consumer privacy legislation that would protect all Americans' privacy. But all of them have included very interesting small provisions that have dramatic impacts on education. And Kristin and Amelia and others in this space have been working to talk a little bit about the implications of these provisions on America's children's education. And it's maybe not as big of a sexy topic as preemption or private right of action, but it is a really important topic because, as Amelia said, education data, information in schools is used to make sure that, for instance, one teacher knows if a student that is visiting her class, if that student's having an allergic reaction, knows who to call, knows how to intervene without having to run to the office and open up the filing cabinet and hope that that information is up to date. Also, it helps schools with their reporting to make sure that they're reporting what they need to report to the state and federal policymakers. It also helps teachers communicate with parents, and parents get the information that they need to know about their students. So I'm going to toss it over to Kristin to talk a little bit about the Kids Online. We're going to start with the Kids Online Safety Act. We'll go into COPPA. We'll talk a little bit about APRA. If folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Again, this is an overview. Many of us are still reviewing APRA. It's a dense bill, but we're happy to entertain your questions. We're all also still trying to figure out how a preemptive federal consumer privacy law would impact state age-appropriate design codes. I don't think we have the answer to that yet, so I'll just put that out there. But Kristin, I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. You know, CDT has a lot of opinions on KOSA. They have for a long time. For me, you know, I'm looking at this specifically in reference to, like, how does this affect schools? So the ways that I've pulled out KOSA, I mean, and Sara just did a great job giving us background on KOSA. And I think for some, like, contextual ideas about, like, where this was intended to apply, this bill seems to be, you know, in response to a lot of attention around social media and, you know, impacts that it has been suggested to have on kids. And so it seems to be an attempt to kind of control, like, what social media companies and other platforms are able to show kids and the kinds of content and mechanisms they're allowed to use. So I don't think KOSA was intended to interfere with any of, K-12 education services or anything. But just the way that it's worded. So KOSA implicates what they call covered platforms, which the definition, I won't read it, but it's very broad. It essentially would almost certainly cover a lot of ed tech platforms. And a big thing that we've seen to be an issue is that it gives like children themselves the right to opt out and modify personalized recommendation systems. That's also defined. What that I think was intended to mean was like social media algorithms, but given, the definition and what it really says, it's very likely that this would implicate things like personalized learning software that analyzes student data to provide curated lessons, to like better facilitate individualized learning. Many teachers and school leaders rely on iterations of this technology to provide high quality education to students. And so to give a child the ability to opt out of a technology that's supposed to be helping them learn and like might be suggesting content that's a little harder for them because it's analyzed that this is an area that they have for improvement. It would really like frustrate the purpose of that technology and undermine a core function of the school, which is to provide individualized learning. Another thing is that kids are also given the right to delete accounts, which, like I said, a lot of ed tech platforms are included in this definition of a covered platform. So if a student could just delete their account, if that account is hosting data about assessments, grades, attendance, things like that, deleting the account on any data associated with the account could result in the deletion of vital education data, as Sara and Amelia were saying. That is like super important / mandatory for state and federal data reporting, which can threaten, first of all, the integrity of academic records generally, but also can have a really big impact on school funding. So that's where I'll leave it on KOSA if anybody else has any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, I'm going to throw, just so folks have it in the chat, the updated bill text from February. There is some language in there that we think is an attempt to consider education, but it's actually, it's a broader carve out than I think the sponsors maybe thought that they were giving. It's a carve out for business to business software, which I think is intended to cover education technology that's providing services to schools, but instead it carves out just business to business software. But and I just thought that was messy. I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that. Just a messy carve out.
So I'll share, because we've been circulating it pretty widely across the Hill. AASA, as I said, I'm the head of their Student and Child Privacy Center, and PIPC, my organization, see a few significant issues in KOSA related to schools that Kristin just went over. A lot of it really is around this wasn't built for schools. And even when you exempt, FERPA or whatever else, well, if a law doesn't touch on FERPA in the first place, then you're not preempting all education technology, or the coverage of all education technology. Things are particularly confused because you have educational video games explicitly mentioned under the definition of covered platforms. So this is just really messy and also really easy to fix. Not all of the KOSA issues are. I think Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn have done an extraordinary job of trying to figure out how to deal with all of the criticisms of the bill. But this is, I think, a little bit of a blind spot and something that they haven't been paying as close of attention to. And since it's likely to move, frighteningly. It's something that I think more people need to speak up about.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that it's not like there isn't data protected in the schools. And I think the intent of the sponsors is to make sure that kids' data is protected. We may disagree with the process in which they think data should be protected, but that's the good faith effort of them trying to protect children's information and their online safety. But kids that are working in a school setting, the products that are designed for the schools that are used under contract with the schools are often, for the most part, or always, designed very specifically for those kids. It's designed to match a curriculum. It's designed to make sure that it's aligning to what the teachers need, to what the administrators need, to what the schools need. They're not trying to be in there willy-nilly just throwing technology into the classroom.
And I think a lot of this came up interestingly when I've talked to folks on the Hill and elsewhere, because they're like, all right, my kid is coming home from school, or I downloaded something during the pandemic and they like playing this math game, but it's not assigned as homework. It's not something they're necessarily doing in the classroom. And I found out that my kid's data can be sold. And so I think there's also this difference that they're trying to regulate the technology that isn't happening in schools and accidentally sweeping in some school used technology that, again, is subject to many, many laws and contracts.
Yeah. And I think just for the spirit of the law, many, like I said before, many of these companies are already designing for kids. They have experts in curriculum development. They have experts in privacy, cybersecurity on their teams that are working to build out tools. So it's not like they're trying to get outside of the requirements. It's just we need to consider how the schools are using it. Amelia, can I toss it over to you to talk a little bit about COPPA?
Yeah,
Kristin,
absolutely.
you have some stuff on COPPA too.
So generally, as many of you probably know, COPPA 2.0 is the new version of COPPA. It expands the age of protection, I believe, up to age 17. It includes various protections like more data minimization requirements and other things. And most excitingly for myself and for the superintendents and others, it now includes the specific codification of schools being able to consent under COPPA. So for those of you who aren't deep in the nerdy weeds of this, in which case you've probably discussed this with Sara and I over drinks, the ability of schools to consent to the use of ed tech instead of having to go to parents to get them to consent is based on the Statement of Basis and Purpose from the 1999 COPPA rule. And that is what we are relying on when we look at the FTC's FAQs for COPPA. And there was a lot of concern that not explicitly including an allowance for schools to consent would be construed as Congress trying to remove that right, particularly given the number of comments that have been filed both this time and previously saying that you should have to go to parents every time you use technology. I don't think anyone's actually thinking of the practicality there, especially not the 32 state AGs that filed comments last time saying that. So very, very thrilled you have a fix that aligns very closely here with what we saw in the recent COPPA NPRM. It has a number of other protections that folks should be aware of, but as of right now, this actually has a much more positive impact on education, certainly than it did prior to the February 15th draft coming out. We also saw the House Companion introduced, and I should say we also saw the KOSA House Companion introduced last Tuesday. The COPPA 2.0 versions in the Senate and House are largely identical, and both have the school consent exception in there. Turn it back over to Sara.
I'm going to toss it over to Kristin because you have some likes and say maybe add a little bit extra into that school provision in there.
Yes, absolutely. I'm like vibrating because I'm ready to talk about it. Yeah, so like, you know, when we were reviewing the NPRM, we CDT advocated for the school authorization exception before my time here. I don't remember the year, if it was, Amelia, you might be able to tell me if it was
2019. And
Okay.
I think 2017, I think.
Yeah.
Filed then too.
Yeah, so we are supportive of that, happy to see it. I think one of the biggest issues that I've pulled out and that I have been talking about ever since I first saw it in the Senate side, and now I've seen it again on the House side, is that the definition that is in the bill is essentially limited to public schools. It essentially says that an educational agency or institution includes only those as defined under FERPA. And if you look at the definition in FERPA, that is essentially just public schools. So the issue there is that now we have a school authorization exception only in public schools, and private schools will not be able to benefit from the same level of, I guess deference is a way to put it, you know, like we want schools to be able to make decisions about the ways that they educate students, the ways that they use certain technologies for other types of educational administration. And, you know, if parents were able to object to every single type of educational technology, you would have kids that are experiencing different curriculums, experiencing maybe different levels of administrative services. And I don't think that we want that. So I think, again, as Amelia said in KOSA, I think this is a very easy fix. I actually think the definition that was in the NPRM is like the most comprehensive definition I have seen for schools. And I think, you know, a little copy and paste job would do quite a bit here.
Yeah, and I put in the chat that if you want to look at the language that's included in the updated COPPA bill text, you can see that on page 25 that I shared. I also think that this doesn't, and we'll let other people talk about preemption, but most of the way that the US educational system leans very heavily on local control and allowing districts to set their own process and procedures. So in this says that they can do that. It doesn't say that schools can't go out and get parental consent for everything, or they can't make sure that there's parental consent for certain things, and actually they're pretty clear. The FTC is pretty clear that if it's outside of the scope of what the school can consent for, they do have to make sure that the vendor is getting parental consent. So local entities can set up their own process and procedures for how this can work. But I think it's an interesting conundrum that we're in here.
Yeah, and if I could just like toss in a little tidbit that I forgot, which is one reason why I think this is so important, which everybody who is on this panel right now already knows this, but when I try to explain this to people who are maybe less familiar with the issue, it's like a kind of a supremacy issue where the commission has indicated that they intend to apply this to all schools. And so if this is what the bill says when it's passed, they can no longer do that. Now they have to go by what the bill says, which is that this only applies to public schools. So an obvious caveat, but that's why this is so important.
It's, again, the small, very nerdy issues, but very important ones to figure out, because school administrators have been dealing with this issue for a long time. Teachers have been dealing with this for a long time and figuring out how to deal with it. And we saw the glimpse of maybe a fix in the NPRM. and then a glimpse and a fix here, and then CDT's helpful suggestions on how to make it a little bit better. I think it's something that it's nice to see something that is interesting and helpful. I think, and so I'm going to move on to the American Privacy Rights Act, APRA. Are we saying APRA?
That's
APRA?
what I'm saying. I'm saying
APRA?
APRA.
Yeah.
I'm doing APRA.
APRA. Somebody will find, we'll all come to a consensus, and probably on Wednesday at Wednesday's hearing. So in the House, Amelia linked to it earlier, the House of Representatives and the Energy and Commerce, one of the subcommittees is having a hearing on Wednesday to talk about COPPA, KOSA, a couple other bills, and APRA, which is the consumer, I talked a little bit about this, which is the comprehensive consumer privacy legislation that would establish national consumer data privacy rights, and also set standards for data security. There's a number of requirements in the legislation, right to access, correct, delete, export data, some provisions on targeted advertising, among other things. It's a pretty hefty bill with a lot of different provisions. There is somebody from CDT talking on, testifying on Wednesday. So we're grateful to have Kristin give her time, even though we know that it's all hands on deck over at CDT. But there are some interesting provisions in APRA. I'm just going to try these out in different ways in APRA that will be particularly impactful in the education section. Number one is it covers nonprofits. So nonprofits, so long as they meet a specific threshold, I think there's a threshold there.
There's a threshold for all businesses.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember.
So
I
there's
think
an
it's
argument of if business is nonprofit.
exactly. So sort of does the mom and pop, thing, and I'll say this literally because my parents started like a nonprofit, like school tutoring association, like does that get swept in or not? I think would be an interesting question. Or does it get cut out entirely like the later versions of ADPPA did?
Yeah. This bill is a week old, so we're all still figuring it out. But in the definitions, covered minor is an individual under the age of 17, age 17, and there are special protections that are required for sensitive covered data. Sensitive covered data includes information about an individual that is a covered minor. So any information about a covered minor under the age of 17 would be subject to these provisions. So that probably makes schools think about it, higher K-12 institutions, higher education institutions, workforce initiatives are thinking about like any sort of provisions that APRA may impact. There is a specific, I'll say, carve out for entities that are subject to FERPA. So that would be public K-12 schools and higher education institutions, public and private. There's also a provision in it's, if anyone wants to know the exact citation, it's section 5, subsection E2V, individual control over covered data. But it says a private elementary or secondary school or a private institution of higher education isn't required to delete covered data that would unreasonably interfere with the provision of education services. That institutions of higher education, the vast majority of them are covered by FERPA because they receive federal funds. So that those two provisions, the carve out for FERPA and then the deletion language, directly conflict there. Amelia, did you have something that you wanted to say?
just another flag in the definition section. APRA, I'm going for it. APRA includes in the definition or excludes in the definition of covered entity, basically those who are acting as processors, subcontractors of government entities. Which is kind of a bit of a win. Like there's still a lot of ambiguity as flagged already. And certainly private higher ed institutions need to talk and look at this very closely. But you do have sort of a little bit of okay, we're not talking about when you're contracting with a government entity here, excluded from APRA, which was honestly a big relief to me, because half of the time when we're dealing with the COPPA 2.0 stuff, the KOSA stuff, the issue is they're acting as contractors. They're just processing the information on behalf of schools who must directly control it under federal and state law. And so having that carved out is an exciting win that I danced about.
And Kristin, I know you had something on the part that I was going to get into next, but I want to toss it over to you.
Yeah. So the thing that I pulled out and that we are kind of really interested in hammering home is the Section 14 of APRA, consequential decision opt-out. So we kind of covered it already. You know, there are exclusions that seem to carve out schools in most respects. So like at the very beginning in the definition section, government agencies, entities, et cetera, are not covered entities. So that would presumably include traditional public schools. Carve out for FERPA would presumably cover every other, you know, charter schools, public schools, everything. But the thing is, when you look at Section 14, it does not say a covered entity. It says an entity. And the way that entity is defined in the bill is an individual, a trust, partnership, association, organization, company, or corporation. So that to me is clearly intended to be a very comprehensive definition. And in addition to that, the way that they have defined a consequential decision includes educational enrollment or opportunity. So it's like pretty clear that this was not intended to not apply to schools. And then education enrollment or opportunity is not separately defined. So, you know, what is an opportunity? I mean, that could be anything from grades, curriculum, et cetera. I mean, that could literally be any use of technology, AI, whatever you want to say, in education. And so this is kind of a blanket opt-out provision where there's no conditions on instances where you would not be able to opt out, no process that's mandated for how to decide what instances are appropriate for opt-out and not. And, you know, the OMB memo just came out that had a lot of really good ideas about how to do that. And so this seems to be kind of in direct conflict with that. And I think even we are all here to talk about education, but even outside of education, this is a pretty glaring issue that I think could have a real impact on how government agencies function and how they provide services. And that is also includes schools. So that's my piece.
Really interesting. As somebody that just went through the DC lottery for my kid, that I'm guessing that they use some sort of technology in there. I don't know how an opt-out function would work.
Can I tell you something, Sarah? That is like one of the big examples that we have been using.
Oh yeah.
Exactly, that is the lottery system, because, you know, if some parents' kids can opt out and others can't, that create, you know, that undermines the purpose and the equity efficacy of the entire program. Like then schools could just select who they want to let in.
Right.
And that's just not how it's supposed to work. So
yeah,
the exact example that we use.
And as stressful as it is, you know that they make every effort to make it fair. And obviously I would love to see behind the scenes how it works. Just for a pure intellectual, like what goes on in the room when you're selecting master numbers. But that is something that has, yeah, really interesting. Anyone before we move to questions, any other thoughts on everything, all of this?
I mean, it feels like everything's popping up at once. I'll also flag, at least if I can find the right tab with the information, the Eyes on the Board Act, which folks may not have been paying attention to, which may receive a markup in the next week or so. Many people may know that there's a whole to-do with E-rate funding and connectivity and some back and forth there. This particular act would prohibit schools that receive funding under E-rate or the Emergency Connectivity Fund from allowing access to a social media platform to students on any supported service, device, or network. Social media is overly broad. It uses the KOSA definition, which is anything where you can upload content. And it also requires schools to adopt a screen time policy, including guidelines disaggregated by grade for number of hours and uses of screen time. And then it also has this really peculiar provision, if I can find it, which seems to say that maybe there's a right for parents to opt out. Here we go. So it's the rule of construction. Nothing may be construed to prohibit parent sanctioned. No idea why parent sanctioned is in there. Learning management systems and school information systems used for purposes of schools conveying content related to the education of students. So if it's not parent sanctioned, does that mean that parents can opt out of the LMS and SIS now? So yeah, so even though we're talking about sort of some of the big news here, there's that, Kristin referenced the OMB memo on AI, which has a significant section on what are rights affecting types of activities, which includes a whole bunch of stuff about education. Like there's a ton happening right now. And it all seems to be coming up for hearings and meetings on the Hill at the same time. And so this is really something where everybody has to be aware, at least, pay Sara to be aware of what's going on. So you know when to talk to people here, when to deal with these issues, because it is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and we are also hearing that there is a chance that COPPA or KOSA, at least in the House, there may be an attempt to roll them up into one bill with APRA. So I don't know what that would do to all of the provisions we've just talked about, the education provisions, but there is certainly a lot of conflict between them. There's already conflict between COPPA and KOSA. There's already conflict between FERPA and COPPA. And there's certainly conflict with the provisions in APRA about information collected about a child versus COPPA's collected from a child. And there's a lot more to come. But I know we had one question in, we got an answer. Or no, we got one question. Thoughts on creating similar EdTech exemption in KOSA as one in COPPA 2.0? Any chance the two are going to get aligned? I sort of just answered that we don't know.
Yeah, and I'll just say it needs to be a slightly different exemption. Like in the document I shared, we had like a couple suggestions because, of course, as I said, everybody's very busy right now. And so I was like, here's what you can do if you want to do this fast. But you have to explicitly say that the parental tools that are provided would be provided to the school or stuff like that, where it's like very minor, but very consequential. Whereas COPPA, at least we were able to just carry over language, particularly when the NPRM came out and when you had the Edmodo decision last year to just say, see, this is the, agreed upon FTC, way to do this. And unfortunately, KOSA is a little messier.
Yeah, and I think I want to be clear that it's not like an exemption for EdTech, especially in COPPA. They still need to do, it clarifies their obligations under COPPA. And with KOSA, it would clarify what they need to follow and when, instead of putting restrictions on things and putting in unclear provisions on ed tech companies that aren't helpful for the schools to figure out. And also it's setting up expectations for parents, so they know what to expect and when, and they know when to exercise their rights and with whom. Otherwise, it's just going to be sort of a free-for-all. Let's see, we had some more questions. Do you think APRA is going to have provisions still apply to ed tech? It seems like they kept the language in there that was in ADPPA, that they say the entities that are subject to FERPA and only the schools. It's sort of a little complicated language there.
Very little carve out. It
Yeah.
doesn't do very much. So you get a lot more out of the fact that it exempts the government entity sub-processors
Yeah.
in that definition. But as Kristin flagged, if they're talking about entities and not covered entities, then that's a massive problem in certain sections.
Yeah. And it seems like they need to, like, there's some stuff that needs to get figured out.
I think in my reading and based on conversations that I've had with other people that are thinking really hard about this, it seems like the idea was that with respect to the information that edtech companies, for example, are specifically holding on behalf of schools and services that they're providing that do come under FERPA obligations, like where there would be some kind of contractual agreement for FERPA compliance, those are exempted from the bill. But I think the idea was that anything that's not covered under that would come under the purview of the bill. Amelia, I'm very grateful that you're nodding because that indicates that I might not be misunderstanding that, but that's what I have come to. That's my theory. That's where I'm thinking.
I think it's going to shift a little, partially because you saw statements from, for example, Pallone that said, you know, we don't have much about children in here, which is why a lot of us are looking at APRA and assuming that COPPA 2.0 at least gets folded in. But you also have, you know, those mentions that are in APRA about education, and it doesn't feel likely that those get removed as you have people talking about how APRA needs more about kids. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues really is that idea of you're using a product at school, it's covered, at home, it's not. This is unfair. We need to pass a law about this. And I've just heard that from so many staffers, especially staffers who are parents, who are very worried about it.
Great. Well, we are at time. I think we're going to have more conversations about this. We haven't had a markup yet. It's just a hearing this week. There's a lot more stuff in these bills and how they'll impact kids. So please reach out to any of us if anyone has any questions. We're always available. And feel free to tune in to the hearing on Wednesday. Thank you, everyone.